Yeah, I started. So, okay, hello.
Hello.
We'll be talking with Alexandra Sage today, a lecturer at University of Roehampton, who is responsible for the module of documentary filmmaking and contemporary documentary filmmaking. And we'll be talking about her newest project, about her childhood spent in New York and America in general. So can you tell us something about yourself to start off with?
Yeah, hello, Mariana. Nice to see you. Yes, so as you said, my name's Alexandra Sage. I'm a senior lecturer in Roehampton, and I've been here for over 20 years, believe it or not. And documentary is my specialism, or non-fiction in its widest sense. I teach third year documentary making, the graduation films. I teach second year documentary production. I teach elements of documentary in theory modules. And I also teach, for the first time this term, a module called contemporary documentary storytelling. So, and that really covers the huge range of different kinds of storytelling that you can find in the genre of documentary. And I think generally students come into these kind of modules and they are pretty much all, by the end, really did not expect a lot of the kind of methods and different types of filmmaking that they come across. So now you introduced my film very nicely. The only thing I would say is that it's not really new in the sense that I have been working on it for about 10 years. The last film I made, I took about 6 years. So I guess it's not too much different from that. And one of the reasons is, well, it's very slow burning. One of the reasons is that it's been shot in New York and I live in London. So I've been shooting it kind of as part of a process every time I go back to New York, which is up until the pandemic been about once a year. And basically what happened was I grew up in New York, and I had a very kind of wonderful multicolored childhood there, full of these kind of incredible memories. You know, it's a wonderful, wonderful place to be most of the time. And I consider myself very lucky. But I then had a very big gap where I didn't go back there for all kinds of reasons, financial and otherwise. And during that gap, a lot of things happened. Some terrible things, some wonderful things. Obama became president. The Twin Towers came down. You know, all kinds of very seminal things that made me very, very homesick. So in about 2014, I managed to go back. I had different circumstances. I had places to stay. I had work I was doing there. So I've gone back every year pretty much since then. So this film, rather than be a kind of intensive shoot, because it deals with issues about the passage of time, it naturally worked in my mind alongside this kind of schedule that I had, where time was passing year by year by year. So in fact, the process becomes hopefully part of the storytelling. So shall I do my PowerPoint?
Yeah, I think you can already start sharing.
Okay. Okay, can you see that?
Yes, yes, I can.
Okay, great. So yeah, what I was going to do today is I was just going to go through some of the ideas behind the work that I've been doing along the kind of culture of theory and practice, the theory behind the practice, so to speak. And then I've got a 10-minute clip to share. So the film has got a working title at the moment, East Side Stories. It's changed its title 2 or 3 times along with its content. And I think, in fact, in the clip, the 10-minute series of clips you're going to watch, I think it's entitled Lost and Found, which was another title that I went through and then dismissed. So there was also a point at the beginning of this where I was thinking of using this material as part of a PhD, a practice-based PhD. So there's probably more kind of theoretical thought and contextualization has gone on than might normally have gone on if I was making a different kind of film. So it's an exploration into memory and the impact of childhood on the rest of our lives. Childhood, particularly in terms of location. So where we come from, where our origins are, and are we alienated from that place? Are we able to access it? Do we feel connected to it? And in my experience, feeling disconnected had a very negative effect, even though you know, I was never going to be fully involved there again. The idea that I was disconnected definitely had an impact on my well-being. So to reconnect has been a very important part of restoring that, but also, you know, we all have an urge to be at one with and understand and be in harmony with our identities. So I started off by thinking about memories, about childhood, about home, and about displacement. Now, sorry, I've just got it. And this is the summary that you put on your website to advertise today's talk. I've renamed it East Side Stories, which I think is the title that will probably stick. And in this kind of exploration about memories and the impact they have on us, I was particularly interested to think about how you could visualize those, how you could represent memories on film. And in my experience, my memories of New York, particularly after a 15-year kind of separation, became very visceral. They were about a particular sound or a particular smell or a particular, they became quite abstracted. There were certain images that were very much stuck in my mind and became kind of seminal. And there were other images, other moments that I could really barely recollect. So they became very fleeting. So, hi, Karine. Yes.
Hello.
So so this idea of what kind of memories do you have? What form do they take? How do they alter over time? And how do you capture them? So what I've done is I've spent a lot of time dealing with archive, and by archive I mean basically the majority of it's still images, and also recent footage where when I was reconnecting, I would go back and over year on year out, I would shoot this footage of Manhattan, basically. So it kind of falls into 2 camps, and then there are overlaps. So the aims that I started out with, partly with this idea of a practice-based PhD, was to explore the power of home and what it means to be displaced, to retrieve diminishing memories and preserve them, and to investigate the potential of the moving image to reflect different types of memories, and to develop a series of recollections into a narrative, because one of the ideas that I've looked into in some detail is this kind of impetus that we all have to make stories of our experiences. And then I've got here on the right hand side, I've got the method, which was very low tech. And in fact, I've got here, this is my makeup bag with all my equipment. That's my main bit of equipment. And I had an iPhone 8 Plus. I have got various little tripods in my bag, a little bag with some radio mics. And I used certain apps which were very important. There was a Rode app, which is a type of microphone. and a very good app called Tapical, which you will hear on one of the extracts that I'm going to screen, where basically you just literally tape your phone call, but it's got quite a nice kind of gritty quality to it. And then I used Final Cut Pro, and I also used iStop-Motion, which you'll also see. I've got a very crude bit of animation that I did. And iStop-Motion, my iStop-Motion cost me $34.99, I think. So it's all super cheap. And the thing, in fact, it's got a lot better. Unfortunately, the clip that you're going to see, I haven't doctored it yet, so it's not very good. It's the sound, because I started off by recording my sound with a hardwired microphone, which of course the wiring didn't reach very far. And it wasn't till probably halfway into the project that I got a radio mic, which I use with my phone, and the sound is 10 times better, which is ironic because I'm actually a sound recordist. So, but the clip you're going to see is as I say, an undoctored rough cut. So there are things I can do to improve the dialogue, and it's mainly, there's a bit in an optician's shop, which is the dialogue is quite muffled. So what I did was, and I was still in kind of thinking mode at this point, is I made a kind of paradigm of memories. And I divided memories up into kind of three main groups. This is my theory, so nobody else's. So I called them primary, secondary, and tertiary memories. Primary memories are hallucinatory flashes, which is a term taken from Joan Didion, whose work I looked at a lot, and who I do refer to a bit later on. She's actually a West Coast American writer, but she then moved to New York and has written a lot about her experiences of living in New York. And she has this phrase, hallucinatory flashes, and that felt like what I was getting, which was, I couldn't quite grasp them, but the feeling was incredibly strong. Then I've got this phrase, which is frames of mind, and that I'll be referring to as well later. And then memory collages. So I started off doing very basic, you can see on the right-hand side, just superimpositions, where I would try and take images that reminded me of certain things. So for example, the bottom right one is quite an incredibly strong memory of being very small and waiting for the school bus with my father, who was wearing a Macintosh, and suddenly realizing I didn't quite know where he was, and going up and hugging the legs of somebody in a Macintosh and realizing it wasn't my father, and just feeling this feeling of absolute kind of horror and shame that I had done that. I was very small. So I was kind of building up stories in my mind and then trying to create anything that could kind of vaguely begin to represent that in a visual sense. So that's what these are down the right-hand side. So then the secondary memories were archive, and I've got masses of archive of very good quality, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Most of the archive is still photographs. There's a little bit of film, but unfortunately I couldn't get access to that today because of this issue I had with the Final Cut, so I can't show you that clip. And then tapes. Tertiary is contemporary recollections of the past, so people talking now about what they remember. And what I've done is I have asked a group of people who were all connected at that time, which was the early 1960s, to talk about similar domestic events. So you have various different recollections of something that's on the surface quite banal, but it's just fascinated me how nobody remembered the same thing in the same way. And then finally, there's new encounters. So new people that I've met as I reconnected. And I was drawn, I guess coincidentally, I'm not sure, but I realized after I had started filming him, this man, Erwin, who runs an optician shop, which sadly has now closed in the pandemic. But when I started going back to New York in 2015, I went into his shop because my glasses were broken, and he and I became really good friends. And I realized that he is a natural storyteller, and that he also talks a lot about his memories, but he became a bridge for me between the past and the present. And he helped me reconnect with this place of my childhood. And yeah, that's it. And then I took a lot of new footage of New York as it is now, and new photographs. So I just wanted to say something in particular about the photos because they are kind of special. So when I was growing up, my kind of unofficial godparents were a couple. So what they did was they took, and they didn't have any children of their own, and they were very attached to me, and they just took endless photographs of various events in my life. And what they did was, so every birthday, day trips, all kinds of things, and they would then, I've got some of them here. So for example, they would make books. So this book is from 1969. And this was my 6th birthday party. So they would take a series of photographs and they would form a little book, and they would all then be here. Try and show you those. So there's just lots and lots of them. So I've got kind of an archive that is not only very personal, but in terms of its photography skills is also really good quality. So what I did when I found those photos was, and I came across the whole box of them. It was quite a shock. I came across a whole box of them just after I had thought about these more abstract ways of making images, of these hallucinatory images. And once I'd seen them, I couldn't really move away from them. They then became the memories, they became the images. So what I have done with them is, when I found them, they had been made into books by the 2 photographers, but then my father had gone back several years later in the 1970s and had written notes, his own notes of memories on the photo. He had attached the photographs. So when I found them, which was in kind of, I don't know, 2018, something like that, I asked my father to reread the notes he had written 10 years after the photographs were taken, 10 years later again. And it was quite interesting because what happened was, as he read the notes, he would start disagreeing with himself, and he'd say, well, such, no, that didn't happen like that. No, that wasn't how it happened. No, I don't think she was there. So it was all this kind of fed into this idea of mine that memories are essentially unreliable. And I liked the way that they changed form over time, and that became a kind of slightly new story. So, and this here at the very bottom right-hand corner is Sonia herself with her camera, although it's very abstracted. So yeah, this is it. Finding the photos, documentation. Here's my father's yellow foolscap. Now, it seems a small thing, but yellow foolscap is a very quintessential American bit of stationery. So, for example, I saw a documentary recently about Woody Allen, and Woody Allen handwrites all his scripts, his screenplays, on yellow foolscap. You know, it's a very kind of, I associate it with America and with New York and with my father. So this is, and his writing is dreadful, as you can see. So this is what I find. And then I record him rereading. And then what I did was I decided to retell some of the stories that people were remembering, which sometimes went with the photographs, sometimes didn't, but went around the time of the photographs. I used the photographs as like a storyboard. So what I would do is I would take a kind of quite a wide shot, not always even, sometimes a mid shot, and I would, instead of just using that image, I would use lots of areas of the image to emphasize different bits of the story. So it's almost like a kind of Hollywood example of taking a master shot, to use an awful phrase, but taking an establishing shot and breaking it down throughout a scene to emphasize certain things. And that's effectively what I did with the photographs. So there's quite a few scenes in the film that are very static, but I just found it fascinating how you can really change the feeling of something by focusing on a different element of its surface. So then I created sequences with these photographs. Now, unfortunately, the sequence you're going to see in the clip, because those of you who have just joined, unfortunately, I had problems this morning. My Final Cut wouldn't talk to my new operating system on my Apple Mac, so I couldn't update the clips that I'm going to show along with this talk. So I was going to add a couple of things. And there's the clip I'm showing you, which uses archive photos, doesn't have an awful lot of this cropping that I'm talking about in it. It has a little bit. But what I did was, so for example, if I had a series of photos about a birthday party and someone was talking about the birthday party, I set myself a parameter that I could only use those photos to illustrate that memory. And if the images were not there to illustrate it, I had to find them somewhere in the photograph. I had to make something new out of it. So, I mentioned frames of mind. Now, frames of mind is a phrase that Oliver Sacks conjured, and I think Oliver Sacks is a fascinating individual. Obviously, he's no longer alive. I'm sure most of you know, he was a neurologist and also a very prolific author. And he wrote about kind of the vagaries and the idiosyncrasies of the human mind, of all kinds of different elements of what it is to be conscious and what it is to be human. And alongside that, he talked about memories. So this is a quote from him. And this is a photograph that, I don't know what came first. I already had this image in my mind when I found the photograph. And I can't tell you whether I remember actually being there or whether the photograph was already so imprinted on my mind from so long ago. But I then experimented with just cropping into different elements of it. So this is what he says: there's no way by which the events of the world can be directly transmitted or recorded in our brains. So to try and represent something exactly, in other words, is impossible. They are experienced and constructed in a highly subjective way, which is different in every individual to begin with, and differently reinterpreted or re-experienced whenever they're recollected. So in other words, we have no hope, really, of having any consistency looking back over things that have happened in the past. And in a way, so what? It doesn't matter. There's this idea that if something isn't accurate, it's not somehow worthy. But if you embrace the idea of storytelling is about embellishment. It's about a rough approximation. And no really good storyteller is probably going to tell the same story twice. So in the same way. So what I also found that was interesting when I looked through the images was there were certain things that kept reappearing. And I'm sure that this is true of most people's childhoods, for example. And one thing that recurred in many photographs over many periods of time were balloons. And, in those days, getting a balloon filled with helium was just an incredibly exciting thing. Maybe that testifies to the greater simplicity that was around then. But those balloons, and then when they burst, of course, you'd be devastated. That really stuck in my mind. And of course, balloons, lots of people have used them. It's very cliched, but it's cliched, I guess, for a reason, because it's this idea of something that if you let go, it disappears. They're lighter than air. You can't really contain them or grab hold of them. And they go on journeys of their own whim, depending which way the wind is blowing. And when they burst, they're gone. So they seemed like a very good metaphor for this idea of trying to recapture something that had already happened, that was potentially lost. And there were just some other recurring motifs that just fascinated me, because of course that's the basis of symbolism, I guess, in film, is that these images that we use again and again that take on a greater meaning than they have in themselves. So cameras also came up many times all through my childhood. There's pictures of me with a little Kodak Instamatic, or a little Brownie camera, or a little red bikes, carousels, dogs. And then when it comes to New York, one of the things I found interesting was that there were a lot of images in my mind, and also I found in various archives of spray and steam. So I don't know if you've ever been to New York, but for one thing, they have vents in the street that emit steam, huge amounts of steam, often above the subway. So, and the reason for that is that the cold air drops into the vent and meets the heat inside and is pushed back up again as steam. So, but when I was young, I thought they were dragons under the street. It was incredibly atmospheric to me. The other thing about New York is that it's any memory of anybody growing up in New York, there's going to be a lot of memories of extreme heat and extreme humidity. And what happens when it gets very hot is they turn fire hydrants on, and you can see that. This is my childhood park, and there's somebody's opened up the fire hydrant, and all the water is coming out. And all over New York, all summer, you see that, people congregating around these children, around these fire hydrants. And then there's also this idea of heat shimmer. So when it gets warm, you get this haze. I'm sure you get it all over Europe as well, but you get this haze where things shimmer above the ground level. And I just thought this quote was quite interesting. So light goes faster through thinner warm air than denser cold air. The warmed air rises and circulates so close to the ground, there tends to be mixed currents of warm and cold air. Looking through this shifting pattern is like peering through an ever-changing lens, producing a shimmer near the ground on a sunny day. And that to me was just a great analogy for kind of memories and, you know, looking backwards, this idea that it's a shift, it's always shifting, and that we're looking through a lens. Obviously, in my case, a lens, but a lens in your mind, or a lens in your hands in the shape of a phone or a camera. It's all the same thing, basically, and it produces a shimmer. So that memories, they're magical. They shimmer. They have charisma. They're intoxicating, and so I just thought that, you know, these were all bits of symbolism that in my larger rough cut repeat, because they mean something to me. Okay, I'm not going to show you that because it's in the larger clip. So yeah, so the tertiary sources we talked about, and I'm nearly at the end of the PowerPoint now, is I picked people who were very, very important in my childhood. Not always my parents. The woman at the top left is like a mother to me, like a second mother to me, and her son, who's on the right with the sunglasses on. You know, I grew up in an apartment in New York, and they lived across the hall in another apartment, and I was in and out of their house all the time. And it was a very, in those days, I don't know if it's the same now, but those New York apartments, you'd have 6 or 7 apartments on every floor, and they were a real community. You know, people knew each other, and for such a big impersonal city, potentially, actually it's a lot less impersonal when you live in those circumstances than you might think. So what I did was, when I started making this film, they were in a lot of my photographs, not necessarily the ones taken by Sonia and Angelo, but some of the other ones I had. And they were certainly a very integral part of most of my memories. So I went back to them and I asked them from a distance if they could write down some of the key things they remembered. And it was interesting because there was quite a lot of overlap. And again, they were all quite banal domestic memories that are actually so important to our lives. They weren't sensational, most of them. They were everyday events that formed the fabric of our identities. And then I went back and I asked them a few months later if they could record the memories that they'd written. And again, like my father in the photos, they would read them out and start disputing what they'd written and saying, oh, no, I don't know why I put that. It wasn't like that. It was like this. And so that added a whole other layer. So, and these are, and that photo at the top is a crop from a photo of me with a little Instamatic camera. And here we have, again, just a bit more of the basis of the thought process when I was still thinking about this idea of a practice-based PhD, is that the two of the key people I was looking at were Joan Didion and Oliver Sacks, who we've already talked about. And this idea that we are compulsive storytellers, that human beings have an unstoppable kind of instinct to document their lives, to make stories out of events. So Joan Didion says we live entirely, especially if we are writers, by the imposition of a narrative line upon disparate images, by the ideas with which we have learned to freeze the shifting phantasmagoria, which is our actual experience. And that goes back again to this idea of shimmering like a kind of heat haze, where you're looking through a lens and everything is shifting all the time. Frequently, our only truth, is narrative truth. The stories we tell each other and ourselves, the stories we continually recategorize and refine. Such subjectivity is built into the very nature of memory and follows from its basis and mechanisms in the human brain. So the second quote is Oliver Sacks, who's talking much more as a scientist because he was a neurologist. And he's talking about the way that the brain actually works, whereas Joan Didion is talking about her perception as a storyteller of what our reaction to our need to create narratives. So so this character Erwin, as I said, when I went back after this long gap and managed, thankfully, to kind of reconnect with New York, the person, I went into the shop to get my glasses fixed. It was around the corner. We start talking. It's a tiny little shop. You'll see it in one of the clips. It's very noisy, traffic going by all the time. It's on Lexington Avenue, people coming in all the time, people he's known for 30 years, people who just come in because something's broken. And one of the things that was interesting, which is, again, not a bit you're going to see today, but is that when I went in there early on, he asked me what my name was, and I said it was Alexandra Sage, and he said, I have a client called Sage. Anyway, to cut a long story short, before I know it, he rings this person. He doesn't ask me, he just rings her. Her name is Lynn Sage, and he passes the phone to me, and she turns out to be a relative of mine from a much more affluent side of the family, who had all these amazing connections to do with funding a building at Columbia University and all kinds of extraordinary, well, kind of quite interesting things, but also was a photographer. So that was all very odd. So I'm through him, through Erwin, I met quite a few people. And Erwin is a Jewish New Yorker. He has a lot of very close experiences of the Holocaust. He is a natural storyteller, and I think, like anybody who's had any close connection to the Holocaust, many of his stories are connected to stories to do with that time, or stories that have just reverberated on and on from that point into the present day. You know, he was kind of unstoppable. And what was quite interesting was in the rough cut that I now have, which is far too long to show here, it's about 40 minutes at the moment. He has become the narrative spine. So whilst there's these various disparate types of sequences to do with photographs or this or that, or interviews, or he has become the thread that carries on throughout. And his story is of himself, of his shop, of the community, and his shop then is closed by developers. And so just before the pandemic, he's thrown out of his shop and people come in and say goodbye to him, and it's like the end of an era. So that's where we get a kind of observational type of filmmaking, because obviously what type of storytelling filmmaking method you use is connected to what kind of story you're telling. If you're telling a story about something that's already happened, then archive photographs lend themselves very well to that. Obviously, you can also have people talking about things that have already happened. But when something is unfolding unpredictably in real time, then one of the methods you might well choose, and is my favorite method, is this idea of observational kind of fly on the wall. Although actually I do break the wall a few times because we chat to each other on either side of the camera. But for the most part, I sat in his shop with my phone on a tripod, just filming people coming in and out. And there's this is quite old. The clip you're going to see today, and as I said, doesn't have great sound, so apologies for that. So yeah, so the clip then is about 10 minutes long, and it consists of three different types of methods. The first one is my father rereading his 70s annotations of the 1960s photographs that he did not take, but obviously he was at the event. The second is a contemporary interview with my new friend, or new in 2015 friend, Erwin Velasky. And the third is a much more recent interview, which has a few little things kind of put in there, little impressionistic moments, which is with Louise, who was very much part of my childhood. So I think that's probably the end of my PowerPoint. I'm sorry, that was a bit long-winded. I don't even know what the time is. Okay, 22. Yeah, so I think the best thing to do is to, if I put in the chat,
I'm not sure we could.
I'm going to stop the share now.
We could try and play it here, well, if you want, but we can also send a link in the chat and then everyone can watch it in their own time. And we'll come back after, let's say, 10 minutes. So.
Well, why don't you make it 15 minutes, and then people can stretch their legs as well. I mean, I don't know. I think it's about 11 minutes, but yeah, we can come back when we've watched it. I think it might be better because certainly the quality of your image isn't too great. So it might be, I mean, the clips aren't amazing quality anyway. I'm just trying to get, yeah, that's it. Sorry. Okay, so.
Yeah, so we can send the links in the chat and then return after 10-15 minutes. I'll be there anytime, so I'll just check if everyone watched it.
Okay, so I'm just getting up the actual link. How are you, Corinne?
I'm fine.
Good.
At home, so that's okay. I'm really happy. I didn't know you were doing this film, and I'm really happy to discover. Thanks to share. It's great. We just
thank you.
teaching and nothing creative. So good.
Thank you.
How are you?
Yeah, I'm all right. Thank you. Pretty good. Yeah, finished finished the kind of things I needed to do for the 21st, so that's good. Okay, so now that's the password. Okay, yeah. So I think now what I've put in the chat is that what I do want to say to you is that at the risk of doing what I always tell students not to do, which is apologizing for what you're going to see, it is very rough. It's not been doctored in any shape or form. And it's not what I would have liked to have shown you, but I had this issue with the final cut and I couldn't get hold of Ian because I left it to the last minute. So I apologize for that. So yeah, I'm not expecting masses of compliments afterwards, but it would just be interesting to have a discussion. So that's it. And it's now about 2:45 by my thing. So if we come back at about 2:55, then we'll just have 5 minutes, won't we?
Yeah, sounds good.
Sure.
Okay.
I still have a couple of questions if needed in the end. So
Are
yeah.
you still there, Mariana?
Yeah, I am.
Okay.
Yeah. Hiya. Should we wait or should I start asking questions? I have a few actually, so.
Sorry, I missed that. I was reconnecting my Bluetooth headphones.
Oh, sorry. Should I start asking questions? Because I actually have a few, just a couple, so it won't take too long. I'm just curious.
No, go ahead.
Why did you actually decide to leave New York if you felt so connected to this place in general? What was the reason?
Well, when I left New York the first time, I was 11, so I had no choice. When I left the second time, my parents went back and forth several times for all kinds of reasons. And I think I had 11 different addresses by the time I was 16. I think we lived in 11 different places. But most of those were after leaving New York in the 1970s. So yeah, there wasn't really, I wasn't really at an age to take that decision into my own hands. Okay. So yeah, we're talking about impressions and influences that really start in very early years, up until about the age of maybe 12.
Okay, and when was the exact point? Do you remember when was the point when you actually decided that you want to make films in the future, that you want to work with documentary maybe?
Yeah, I just finished university and I did a degree in English and I had done a bit of journalism, but I wasn't a great journalist. I found it was such a quick turnaround. Anyway, for whatever reason, I was too young I didn't want to commit to anything. So I went to work at the Arts Council because I was just kind of looking for something to do that would be interesting. And I worked for the assistant, I was the assistant film and video officer. So I worked for a man called David Curtis, who is a great expert on various aspects of experimental cinema, particularly animation, people like Len Lai. So I was very immersed in a kind of world of film. My father had also been a filmmaker, which I think had an awful lot to do with it. He went on the GI Bill, he went to film school in Paris, EDEC, and he had always, I guess, also been quite an influence on me. But it all kind of came to a head where I met a woman called Diane Tammis, who sadly died last year, I think it was, within the last year anyway, and was an amazing woman who was a documentary maker, who was the first woman to teach documentary at the National Film and Television School, and was one of the first people in this country to make films using kind of observational techniques, and just made some really wonderful films. And I was lucky enough to work with her as a sound recordist, and that kind of kicked it all off. So it's a few things really.
So did you actually decide for yourself that you want to go into sound recording, or was it kind of like imposed on you along the way?
Well, it was kind of pragmatic, to be honest, because when I went to film school, I went and did a postgraduate, I did an MA at a film school, and I didn't particularly want to be a camera person, and I think as a young woman at that time, I wasn't particularly confident. So it didn't really occur to me to try and be a director, which is funny because on the surface I was a very assertive person, but I think a lot of women in those, it's always been it's an ongoing problem with us women, is that we don't always look at ourselves in the best light possible. So I kind of thought, oh well, they won't let me in to do that, so I'm really interested in sound, and I'll go for sound recording, because also I knew that there was a culture, particularly in observational filmmaking, of director sound where you work, because obviously if you're filming observationally, you're trying to be inconspicuous, you're trying to melt into the background so that people forget you're there. And the best way to do that is to have as few people as possible, and you have like a kind of silent communication with sign language. You're not even speaking to each other, so you have to be very in tune with what the other person's doing, and you have to have a very, very good understanding of how scenes are constructed, so that as something is unfolding, you're thinking ahead all the time, but you can't predict what's going to happen. And you're thinking, well, if I'm going to make this cut together, I know I need a shot of them leaving the room, or I need this, or I need that. And sound in those scenarios doesn't always follow camera perspective, because in an observational scene, a lot of the time it's the sound, the dialogue, that is holding the narrative. So it's actually a very important job. Sound is very underestimated. People think sound recording is boring.
That's
and actually, when it's at a high level, it's not boring. And the other thing was that it was a pragmatic choice because it was less popular. And I have to say, when I left film school, I was never out of work. I worked solidly for 6 years. I had an agent. I earned a lot of money. It was a hard life because it was very itinerant. I had to go to another country at the drop of a hat. I had to just have a passport ready. And so it's not something I would have carried on indefinitely. And, you know, there were 8% women in those roles at that time. So it was it wasn't always the easiest culture to be in. But I was good at it, and I was very reliable. And so I did well. But I have to say that literally the day my son was born, from that day on, my first child, I never worked as a sound recordist again in that same scenario, because I couldn't stay after 6 o'clock, and I couldn't come to an airport at 24 hours notice, and it was finished. So I'm sure the culture now is more sympathetic. This was 1997 when my son was born, and there was no way that you could carry on that job with a young child. It might sound ridiculous now, but that is what it was like, because there were just lots of men who didn't care how late they stayed, didn't care, you know, didn't have to go home at any particular time, were very happy to get paid double time or time and a half overtime, or which is fine if you have no ties, but it doesn't work if you do. So, you know, for a while it was great. I saw all kinds of different parts of the world I never would have seen otherwise. I've seen all kinds of directors at work, on set and on location, and I learned an awful lot from doing it.
Yeah, I can relate. So, I mean, I can't relate, but sorry, continue, please.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, it's striking because, sorry, I missed the beginning of your presentation.
No, don't worry.
I don't know if it's, you know, like a long term, I don't know anything, but when I saw what you just shared with us, the sound is very rich. It's very rich, but in PowerPoint you discuss more about the, you know, the pictures and so yeah, that was exactly the same question. Is because you have been a sound engineer or sound, you know, how this affects maybe unconsciously or consciously your memory as well. How you and I love the image where it's static, but the sounds bring all the past alive, and it's another. It's very sensorial. And the same when you interview the opticians and he's discussing about the Holocaust, and we have in the background this very like music, and so that as well very interesting in there. So I don't know if consciously you are very, you know that you have these two layers, like the sound, the image, and
yeah, I don't know, maybe, but I think there's two things that are quite interesting. One is that you know, every city has a soundscape, obviously. And I think, I don't know about you, but I can remember being very young and it was just sirens all the time. Even high up, even on the 12th or 15th floor, it's several different types of sirens. And they're not like any sirens that I've heard anywhere else. So, and it's very evocative. And I think sound cuts through to a very subconscious area of our brains. And the other thing I find really interesting is that when you look at films that use archive, how it changes the position of the voice in terms of it foregrounds the voice. You know, if you're looking at somebody speaking in sync on camera, it's very different to the way you receive the tones of the voice when you're looking at still images. And I've always been quite fascinated by that. So Yeah, I don't know, but I suspect if you made a film about your childhood, maybe you have anybody who's listening, I suspect sound would play a very big part as well, because I think it just is very evocative in terms of our memories.
That is really hard to record, because if it's past, it's past. You can record New York today, but how can you get? There is some archives of sound, but it's something a bit different.
Yeah,
so.
it's true. I don't know. I guess you just have to. You're just trying to give an impression of what you best remember, I suppose. But yeah, although actually even now, I mean, my father's still alive. He's 91. And even now, when I hear his voice, even over a crackly telephone, I kind of, you know, it's very, very evocative reaction, a strong reaction. So it's quite, I just find voices quite interesting, language and voices. And, you know, Erwin has a very, unfortunately, you might not be aware of it from that clip, but he has a very thick New York accent. And yeah, it's like music to my ears, but yeah.
Something to explore.
I agree with Corinne that the soundscape is very rich, and I particularly like the animation part with the balloon. And I'm curious, what are you going to like develop this bit with the balloon traveling through New York, or is it just going to be simply just balloon traveling and showing the
Yeah,
place?
I might do. I mean, the great thing about the balloon is that, yeah, I think I will. I mean, again, it might be a bit of a narrative spine, because the problem with this work is that there's so many disparate things going on that try different methods, and the methods change from sequence to sequence. They kind of segue, but they keep changing. That to have something continual like a character or a metaphor that goes through is quite a good way to kind of make things gel together. So I probably will do that. I mean, I don't know if you ever went there, Corinne, but you know, did you ever go to Ashburnham? No. Okay, so it's a retreat that Roehampton was going to once a year.
Yes, I heard about it, but I was too busy. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think I definitely went twice. Yeah, I went twice. And it was amazing because there's no phone reception there. There's like virtually no Wi-Fi. And I took the animation software and a laptop. And when I got there, the weather was good and there was a ping pong table. And I went out and bought some blue paper and made this whole fake blue screen and spent a whole week just messing about with that. So that 2 minutes took something like 5 days. 5 days. So it's pretty slow process, but and it's very crude, obviously, but it's really it's just such great fun. And in fact, I've just marked the contemporary documentary storytelling essays, and there were a couple of essays that wrote about animation in such eloquent terms, you know, how animation can kind of re-envisage things that you're retelling in a way that just nothing else can. So yeah, it's you know, you can never do any of those things if you had any kind of deadline. I mean, I'm sunk as far as that kind of career is ever. That's dead in the water for me. But there we go. So be it. Yeah.
The hybrid forms is interesting as well. But from the extract we have seen is because automatically we think of the modality. What is memory? What is the best? Is it too quick, too slow? Oh, animation is interesting. Oh, real interviews. I don't mind at all this hybridity, in fact, because it's a bit more awake. Like otherwise, I dive inside kind of a universe, one universe. So there's something interesting in that. I know it's not the final product at all, but I don't.
Yeah, I think that the great thing about doing anything that's anything to do with yourself, or anything that you remember, you know, your own embodied kind of truth, so to speak, is you can. Nobody can ever dispute, you know, oh, I see it like that, or I think that's the best way to represent that, because who could say otherwise? So in a sense, I guess the hybridity of it is just kind of a way of exploring, but also because that's how those thoughts appear to me. You know, they're all very different. They might come in a dream, or they might come because I hear a piece of music, or I hear a siren, or I suddenly look at my daughter's face and think that reminds me of me, or that, you know, so they come in all different shapes and sizes. And I find it really interesting how linked we are to those things. And, you know, how, I mean, I suppose, you know, it's this idea that so few of us actually remain in the place where we began. And what that means, you know, is that, and I think it can be very painful sometimes not to be in the place where you began. And you know, you never quite, of course, once you leave the place you begin, you never quite go back there again and belong, and you never quite belong in the place you've gone to. So in some ways that's fabulous, because who wants to be trapped anyway? But in other ways it's quite difficult. I think it's quite difficult. And I mean, I'm sure that you, Corinne, can relate to that maybe, and Mariana can relate to that. And I don't know, Charlie, if you can relate to that, but you know, it's not like, it's a very different thing from just being somewhere and remaining in that place.
Yeah, definitely. I felt that when I moved to London to study already, even though I'm quite young, I already felt that. So, and I specifically like the hybridity of it, because I feel like
you froze.
Oh, sorry. I specifically like the hybridity of it, because I feel like specifically in the times we live in right now, like there's not too many, you know, of those elements that would distract us. I think we need more and more kind of distractions and inputs, and then we are already able to kind of absorb this. We're not getting confused with that. So the hybridity is not a problem. I think it really actually complements, the elements are complementing themselves. So I really like this.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually, that we are, I mean, you know, the kind of things that you were exposed to in the 1960s, you're talking about photographs that take 2 weeks to get developed. You're talking about 4 TV channels and books and drawings. And it's very simplistic how you experienced things through several filters, but now it's through multiple filters and through all kinds of different directions. And I think it'd be really interesting to see what it does to, say, someone of, you know, of your age, Mariana, who, you know, how your memories appear to you in 40 years time, because they've been created in such a different way, and because you're never going to think, what did that look like? Because you're going to have a hard drive with all your photos, or you're going to go into iCloud, and they're just going to be there already, like an imprint. So yeah, it's very interesting.
I sometimes catch myself, and you probably too, can catch yourself with like watching films from 1940s, let's say. I recently watched and Then There Were None, based on Agatha Christie's novel.
Oh, yeah.
And I watched it and I felt like, oh my God, this is so slow going. I mean, this is maybe not a bad example. This was an eventful film, but other films from those times are really slow going. The frames are just staying on one person for such a long time, and the acting is obviously different. So I catch myself really being distracted easily, even though
it's the speed with which things are edited is probably on average much faster now, and there's less time for reflection while you're watching something, which I think is a pity. But just going back to this idea of being detached, I do think it's something, ultimately, I don't mean to sound negative about it, I think it's something to be embraced. And I think that, you know, if you look at your work, Mariana, for instance, all of it is imbued with this difference, and it's very rich in material. it's a privilege, really, I think, to be able to look at something from afar and to go back and forth between something like that. And, you know, it's this idea that doesn't matter how simple a domestic tale it is, it's like taking somebody to somewhere that they can't go. And I would happily look at all your domestic tales, because, or your memories or whatever, because I just never have seen them before. And so that's inherently already kind of, you know, interesting, fascinating.
I feel like all those portrait like documentaries are always so interesting, because no matter what person who that is, basically I always really gladly watch it because it's so interesting, whether it's an artist or a scientist, whoever. Yeah, I love it. And the last question I have to end with is, what topics are your favorites when it comes to documentary? When you choose a topic, what would you rather do? Portrait of someone, or portrait of a location, or investigative documentary?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's always kind of character-based stories, you know, stories about just ordinary stories, really. And I think location is very, very important. I love urban environments. I love how people's rooms can tell us a lot about them. I made a film before about two elderly people who were very good friends, and how they had very just completely different lives, and they'd ended up in this small town, become very close friends, and they literally couldn't have been more different. And I just loved how the way that they lived and the objects that they had around them, and the way they moved through their spaces and their daily habits. How I love the subtext of all of that. So yeah, I don't think probably I'd make an investigative documentary, although I like to watch them. And I do think location, it's like a painting, it's like the backdrop, it's absolutely crucial, essential. Yeah, so and in terms of other people's documentaries, I love documentaries that explore the past and how the past relates to the present. So, you know, like Chantal Ackerman's News from Home that I showed on the contemporary documentary storytelling module. I love Chantal Ackerman, and I love the way that every film is different from the one before. And I mean, there's some that group together in similar groups, but she never stops trying different things. That's not me, but I think it's really wonderful. And I love Sarah Polley's Stories We Tell. I love the way that we don't quite know what's truth and what's fiction. And so, yeah, I love that hybridity between, you know, objective fact and subjective fact. And I like the way that whatever any of us say in our films, no one ever can say is incorrect, because we said it's the way it is, so it has to be the way it is. And I like that.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting.
That's okay. Thank you very much.
I would ask more questions, but we are running out of time. Like, we're actually over time already. So, Karine, do you have any other questions, or?
No, it's fine. I'm really happy you shared that. It's great. It's fantastic.
Oh, thank you, Karine.
So,
yeah, well, I want to talk to Muriel sometime, because I know that, you know, she sent out the thing saying she's found hundreds and hundreds of photographs, and she's trying to reproduce them. So I'm a great fan of that. But anyway, we'll talk another time. I'm just about to do a Zoom with Grenoble University on behalf of my daughter, who's out waitressing. So I'm pretending to be her and taking some notes. So fingers crossed.
Let me know. I'm supposed to fly to Grenoble the 12th of July.